Everything you are, everything you do, everything you see or touch, love, all of it is made up of atoms, trillions of them, arranged into separate, individual entities. A person who can wake up, move, work, and the things they can sleep on, move around in, and work with. That's the version of reality we've all quietly agreed on. That the universe is made of separate, well-behaved little objects, each one existing on its own, whether or not anything is watching. But in 1961, one quantum experiment completely shattered this assumption. And the single result from this experiment has haunted physicists for over 60 years. How can something exist in two places at once? How can the simple act of looking at something change what it is? And if the atoms making up your body, your home, your entire universe don't behave the way we've always assumed, then how do we know what's real? This is the experiment that changed everything we know about quantum physics and, by extension, reality as a whole. In the summer of 1801, in a dim room in London, a physicist named Thomas Young was trying to settle an argument that had been running for over a century at that point. Isaac Newton, regarded as the father of classical physics, believed that light was made of particles, like tiny bullets all fired in a straight line. But although some others believed light behaved like a wave, rippling outward the way that water ripples when you drop a stone into a pond, Newton's reputation was so towering that for 100 years, almost no one dared challenge him outright. At least not without a mountain of evidence to disprove him. So, Young decided to test it directly. He took a beam of light and passed it through two narrow, parallel slits cut into a card, letting the light fall onto a screen behind them. So if light was made of particles, he would get two bright strips on the screen, one behind each slit, and that's it. However, this isn't what Young saw. Instead, the screen lit up with a pattern of alternating bright and dark bands, all stripes, repeating again and again across the surface. It was the exact result you would get if, instead of a particle, you had two waves colliding, rising together in some places and canceling each other out in others. It's the same pattern you see when you drop two stones into a still pond and watch their ripples cross. So there you go, Young had his answer. The experiment had shown it. Newton was wrong. Light was a wave. Case closed. Well, case closed at least for the next 100 years. But physics wasn't finished with this experiment. Not even close. Because although it holds up perfectly at the classical scale, when scientists shrunk it down to the level of quantum particles, well, the results got a lot stranger. 160 years after Thomas Young's experiment, in a physics laboratory at the University of Tübingen in Germany, a scientist named Klaus Johnson was preparing to rerun the experiment. Except this time, instead of a beam of light, he was firing electrons, one of the tiny particles that make up every atom in the universe, including the ones in your own body. There was a strange kind of irony in this. A century and a half earlier, Isaac Newton had insisted that light itself was made of particles, and Young's experiment proved him wrong. But by 1961, while everyone had agreed that light was a wave, not a particle, we had a new false assumption. That matter, the actual stuff of the universe, was made out of particles. It's solid, discrete, they're countable particles. Newton had lost the argument about light, but nobody even thought to reopen it about electrons. So, when Klaus Johnson fired his electrons through two narrow slits, one at a time, he expected them to travel through one slit or the other, each landing in one spot on the screen behind it, and eventually build up to two distinct clusters, just like Newton had imagined. But they didn't. Instead of two clusters, the electrons built up the same striped alternating pattern that Young had found with light 160 years earlier, the unmistakable signature of a wave interfering with itself. But what was even more concerning was that, unlike Young, who fired a beam of light, Johnson carefully fired his electrons one at a time, so there was nothing for it to interfere with, which meant something even more unsettling was happening. Each electron, alone, was moving through empty space and somehow behaving as if it passed through both slits at the same time, and then it interfered with itself on the way to the screen. One of the things that keeps physicists up at night is the fact that reality, at its most fundamental level, only becomes real when it's observed. Before that, everything is just probability, a ghost of what could be. To make this easier to understand, imagine all the files you store on a traditional cloud server, your photos, your documents, your private conversations. Everything exists as just random zeros and ones until someone observes it. Now, most of the time, the only person that should be able to observe it is you. But unfortunately, that's not the case with a lot of big corporations. This is exactly why I prefer Phylon, the sponsor of today's episode. Phylon is a cloud storage provider that's built on zero-knowledge encryption, meaning there's never any observer in the chain except you. Not hackers, not governments, not even Phylon themselves. Every file you upload is split into chunks and encrypted on your device using AES-256, and a master key is generated from your password. By the time anything reaches their servers, it's already unreadable. Your encryption key never leaves your device. Ever. And it's not just secure, it's fully featured. You get real-time sync across all of your devices, so your data is always up to date. Encrypted notes and chat built right in, automatic photo backups, a virtual drive that works like a local folder, and encrypted public sharing links when you need them. There's even a CLI tool, web DAV support, and a developer's SDK for the more power users. Their infrastructure is entirely self-hosted in Germany, ISO 27001 certified, runs on 100% renewable energy, and the whole platform is open source, so you can verify the encryption for yourself. To protect your digital privacy, switch to Phylon by clicking the first link in the description. Now back to our story. Johnson's electron experiment didn't come out of nowhere. Decades before he ever loaded a single electron into his apparatus, two of the greatest physicists humanity had ever seen had a fierce debate on this exact topic, with the only difference being that at the time, neither of them could test their ideas. In October of 1927, in a conference hall in Brussels, the world's leading physicists gathered for what would become one of the most famous scientific meetings in history, the Solvay Conference. Among them were Albert Einstein and Niels Bohr, two men who respected each other deeply and disagreed just as deeply about what quantum mechanics actually meant. Bohr's camp believed that particles, before being measured, don't have a definite position at all. They exist as a spread of possibilities, a wave of potential, and they only choose a location the instant something interacts with them. Now, Einstein hated this idea. He believed the universe had to be definite whether or not anyone was looking. So he proposed a way to catch quantum mechanics in the act. Picture a single slit, Einstein said, cut into a screen so thin and delicate that it hangs from a tiny spring. If a photon of light passes through that slit, it has to nudge the screen slightly on its way through, the same way a bird brushing a leaf makes it shiver. If you could measure that tiny nudge, you would know for certain which slit the photon went through, all while the interference pattern kept forming behind it. Particle and wave caught at the same time, and that would be proof that Bohr was wrong. Bohr took the challenge seriously, and it didn't take him long to find the flaw. To measure the spring's motion precisely enough to know which slit the photon passed through, Bohr showed you'd have to disturb the spring itself so much that it would blur the position of the slits. And the moment the slits themselves became uncertain, the interference pattern would have nowhere stable to form. It would just vanish. You could know which path the photon took, or you could see the interference pattern, but never both. Even though Einstein walked away from Brussels unconvinced, Bohr won that debate, and physicists would spend the rest of the century proving him right over and over again, in laboratories he never could have imagined. Because Bohr's argument was never really just about photons. If it was true for light, it had to be true for the solid, physical stuff of the universe too. Atoms, electrons, the particles making up your own body. Decades later, when Klaus Johnson fired those electrons through his own two slits, he wasn't stumbling onto something new. He was watching Bohr's 40-year-old argument play out in real time. In the decades since, scientists all over the world have run this same test, in dozens of forms, with photons, with electrons, with atoms, far larger than either. And every single time, Bohr's prediction has held. When researchers place a detector at the slits determined to catch which slit each particle goes through, it does. Each particle passes through exactly one slit and never both. 50% take the left, 50% the right. It's all clean and orderly, just like Newton's bullets. But finding which slit the particle takes and how that particle behaves are two very separate issues. Finding how the particle behaves is where we get the strange results. When the detector is on, you get two simple clusters of electrons, one behind each slit, exactly what you would expect from tiny, solid particles with nothing strange about them at all. But once you turn the detector off, the stripes return immediately, like waves washing over a sandcastle. This particle-wave duality is at the heart of quantum mechanics. In isolation at the subatomic level, matter behaves like a wave whose position is not certain. This quantum state is called superposition. The particle could exist anywhere along the wavelength. It's not determined. Only when there is some kind of physical interaction, like the detector, does matter behave like a particle that is predictable by classical physics. It's a process called decoherence. Now, does this mean that reality essentially disappears when there's no one to observe? Or, in simpler terms, if a tree falls in the forest and there's no one around to hear it, does it make a sound? When the double-slit experiment was conducted at the subatomic level, some scientists suggested that conscious observation might be causing photons to behave like particles. This seemed to imply that reality was dependent on an observer. To be is to be perceived. But the observer in the double-slit experiment isn't inactive the way we think of an observer. It's not just a mind. It's a detection tool that is making a very small physical interaction with the photon or the electron. It's that interaction that's causing the quantum object to go from behaving as an indeterminate wave to a particle. Reality ultimately doesn't require an observer to exist, which is sadly less fun, but still interesting. The reason you don't see everyday objects like bricks or cats behaving like waves is that they are constantly interacting with things such as air molecules, light, and heat. These interactions cause immediate decoherence. A cat is thus made up of determinate particles, or at least they mostly are, which we'll get to later. The double-slit experiment does, however, demonstrate something very important about reality that does have philosophical implications, even if not directly. It reveals that the properties of matter depend on relationships and interactions with other systems. Essentially, the cat is only a cat because it interacts with air molecules, with light and heat, and, of course, your hands for those nice belly rubs. No single particle exists independently, at least on the subatomic level. In 1665, Newton demonstrated that the universe is made of indivisible, self-contained atoms, governed by universal laws such as the law of motion and universal gravitation. To this day, his laws remain useful for good approximations of most physical phenomena. His description of the universe, governed by natural laws, directly went against the more religious understanding of physical phenomena. Instead of divine guesswork, he showed how the physical world could be understood and explained with rational laws and mathematical physics. Philosophers were inspired by Newton's scientific revolution and used it to charge their movement that came to be referred to as the Enlightenment. John Locke, a close friend of Isaac Newton, took his friend's method of relying on empirical observation and applied it to humans and society. So just as Newton discovered the natural laws of the universe, John Locke sought to uncover the natural laws of humanity. Locke rejected the idea that humans possessed innate knowledge as suggested by Plato's theory of knowledge as recollection. Instead, he suggested that humans begin life as blank slates. All of our knowledge comes from experience then, and through this experience we move from simple ideas to more complex ones and eventually develop the ability to engage in moral reasoning. To identify natural laws of humanity, Locke explored a state of nature, much like the political philosopher Thomas Hobbes. Hobbes suggested that humans were selfish in a state of nature and were prone to violence and cruelty. To escape this condition of constant war and violence, humans have to give up their freedom to the power of the monarch. It's the only way to maintain peace and safety, according to Hobbes. So Locke didn't have such a pessimistic view of humanity. He believed that in a state of nature, humans were rational creatures, not innately selfish ones. Humans want to protect their lives, their liberty and property, and are obliged by natural law to respect the lives, liberty, and property of others. Locke considered these natural rights. And to protect these rights, humans had to leave a state of nature and institute an impartial power. This same power is obliged to maintain natural rights by arbitrating disputes and addressing injuries. This is, in theory at least, how our legal system operates. If the government doesn't uphold these natural laws, it is betraying the social contract. We would be justified in removing them by the majority's decree. In this connection, from Isaac Newton to John Locke, we get a specific idea of what a human being is. Just as Newton identified individual atoms obeying the laws of nature, Locke identified the sovereign individual who, by natural laws, seeks to protect their lives, their freedom, and their property. Locke's work has had a tremendous impact on society from his time to ours, for better and for worse. He's even shaped our notion of what a person is. But did he get it right? Locke's understanding of human beings is a philosophy of individualism. Every person has ownership and responsibility for their own body and their own labor in Locke's view. This implies freedom not only from state control, but also from state and communal support. In other words, John Locke placed a big emphasis on self-reliance. Locke's individual has their own unique pursuits that aren't vulnerable to outside influence. They're fixed, they're sturdy, and they're capable on their own. To this day, Western society has largely upheld this understanding of humanity as made up of sovereign individuals who need to carve our own path. We look inside to find our own unique calling, and we use our own faculties to pursue them. If we fail, it's because we need to try harder. When times are tough, we have to pull ourselves up by our bootstraps and march forward. But this prevailing understanding of a person is starting to show signs of weakening. And it's in quantum mechanics, actually, that we find way more clues of where humanity is headed in its quest to better understand itself. From the double-slit experiment, we can observe that reality is relational. Matter, on the subatomic level, doesn't exist as fixed particles in isolation. It's a probability until it interacts with other systems. But there's something even more confounding happening at the quantum level that could have big implications for how we understand ourselves in the future. These subatomic particles that I referred to earlier, the ones that behave as probabilities when isolated, well, they can be, and often are, linked together at the quantum level. That means that when we measure linked particles, they give the same readings, such as matching polarizations. Given that these measurements are the result of randomness, that's pretty extraordinary. But even more interesting is that these linked particles don't have to be close together. They can be thousands of light years apart and still measure the same. This is why scientists now suggest that reality is non-local. Locality asserts that objects can only be influenced by their immediate surroundings, but with quantum entanglement, that is clearly no longer true. This leads us to a very important question. If subatomic particles can be linked together beyond locality, does that mean life might be full of other entanglements that we just don't know about? And is it possible we're far more connected than John Locke would suggest? Now, before we get too excited about the possibilities, we do need a reality check. As you may recall, quantum particles decohere from a superposition state when they interact with any other system. The larger systems exist largely as objects of classical mechanics. They are no longer quantum, in other words. Organic life tends to be very moist and generates heat. So to be a part of such a system is to likely be an object of classical physics. The likelihood of quantum behavior impacting the human body is not super likely, given how squishy and heat-generating we tend to be. But just as Newton inspired the Enlightenment, quantum mechanics is at least coinciding with a movement away from individualism and towards philosophies that explore our interconnectedness, with quantum theories potentially bridging the gap between science and philosophy. The theoretical physicist David Bohm suggested that the universe is an undivided wholeness. The three-dimensional reality that we observe is just a surface, where in reality, the universe is wholly interconnected. Relational quantum mechanics, as developed by Carol Rovelli, suggests that objects don't possess standalone intrinsic properties. The properties only exist in relation to other objects. As a result of this view, the universe is a vast, interconnected web of relations rather than separate, discrete parts. These quantum theories from Bohm and Rovelli have parallels with what is broadly categorized as Eastern religion and philosophy. In the Advaita Vedanta school of Hinduism, there's not a notion of a god that's external to us. Brahman is an all-encompassing reality that pervades all things, including ourselves. Every one of us is Brahman and makes up our entire existence. Think of it as a consciousness that manifests the world and everything in it. You're not a thing that happens to possess consciousness. You are consciousness. In the Advaita Vedanta school, seeing differentiation in the world is an error that comes from naivete. We are all pure consciousness, not independent parts. This conception of reality aligns pretty well with David Bohm's suggestion that the universe is an undivided wholeness. In Taoism, there's the concept of the unhewn garment. The basic idea is that the objects that we distinguish and identify don't really exist in nature. We cut the objects from the garment of existence, but the whole of the garment is reality, not the shapes that we cut out of it. The shapes serve as practical, but we shouldn't take them so seriously. When you treat cut-out pieces of the garment as truly separate, you cause real problems. You're severing things from their larger systems. When you remove a leaf from a tree, the leaf doesn't survive in its separated form. It withers and it dies. In Buddhism, there's the concept of dependent origination. According to the Buddha, no phenomenon exists independently of causation. A plant, for example, is dependent on a seed. It's depending on the water, the air, the earth, sunlight, and so on and so on. Everything arises from some root cause. There is no uncaused cause. Suffering is caused by craving and clinging, and Buddhist enlightenment is caused by the path to end suffering. The Buddha famously asked numerous kings to address crime by reducing poverty instead of punishing people after the fact. Crime, after all, doesn't come from nowhere. It's caused by someone lacking the fulfillment of their basic needs. Outside Eastern religions, philosophical movements rose in the 20th century that sought to move beyond the values of the Enlightenment. Postmodernist philosopher Michel Foucault wrote a well-known essay called What is Enlightenment? In the piece, Foucault offers critical insight into Immanuel Kant's text by the same name. Kant described the Enlightenment as a movement away from relying on external authorities, such as the state and the church, towards thinking for ourselves and making our own decisions. In Foucault's essay, he suggests we need to take things a step further. We need to investigate the invisible rules, the norms and power structures that shape our reality and our sense of self. For Foucault, this is how we ultimately liberate ourselves from the limitations that are imposed on us. To undertake this project, Foucault used a genealogical method, borrowed from the philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche. It's a historical approach to deconstructing truths that we take as self-evident. In many of Foucault's texts, he would dissect the origins of concepts and map out the accidental and often messy way they emerged and became accepted then as truths. Famously, he explored how the way prisons functioned to impose self-discipline was spread to institutions throughout society, such as mental institutions and even schools. Foucault's goal wasn't to find universal truths, but rather to free ourselves from concepts that restrict us, such as the Enlightenment and the idea of the self-made individual. Without the so-called truths of the Enlightenment weighing humanity down, non-humanist philosophies have explored concepts that acknowledge the rationality that is implied by quantum mechanics. Deep ecology is an eco-philosophy movement that asks us to move away from a human-centered worldview to one that gives equal value to non-human life. While there are many different approaches and ideas in the movement, it ultimately comes down to seeing non-human life as valuable in itself, and to humans as well. We are all connected to our environment, and we pay the price for its degradation. When we excessively consume animals and materials, we make the land less capable of regenerating itself. That's less productive land for us and for the rest of nature. The deep ecology movement generally maintains that humans don't have the right to reduce the richness and diversity of life except to satisfy vital needs. Now, whether you fully agree with that assertion or not, I think it's pretty clear that our destructive impact needs to be greatly curbed. Perhaps acknowledging our interconnectedness with our environment is a good place to start. Resolving environmental problems faces many different obstacles, but perhaps the greatest challenge is something that quantum mechanics has already hinted at. When we think of reality as relational and full of hidden quantum behavior, it makes understanding the whole rather complex, as it always must have been. We are not dealing with isolated parts that can be understood on their own and then built up to an understanding of the whole. We're dealing with complex systems as described by complexity theory. If you try to dissect a system in isolation, like an atom, it doesn't work. You're cutting off a source of much of its behavior. You lose understanding in the process. Another issue is that the computers used to analyze systems are rule-based. Nature and humans are not confined to rule-following behavior. A computer can make approximations, but not certainty, just as quantum objects don't exist at a specific point. However, in addressing the relationality of systems, complexity theory can guide us to a better understanding of system behavior, even if we're never able to capture them perfectly. As you can see, quantum mechanics serves as a nice metaphor for the emerging and ancient values of interconnectedness. They're helping us better understand our world and our place in it, improving upon Newtonian physics and moving on from the values of the Enlightenment. But there are still possibilities for uncovering meaningful quantum discoveries that could change everything we know about how we interact with our world. They may even give us scientific evidence of our interconnectedness on a much deeper level. There's a growing field called quantum biology, and it's turning up something very strange. Living things may be using quantum effects like entanglement, superposition, and tunneling deep inside of their own cells, effects that classical physics simply can't explain. A study of enzymes revealed that hydrogen was cutting through energy barriers using something called quantum tunneling, rather than going over these barriers. Another recent study suggests that DNA mutations can also come from quantum tunneling. Atoms of hydrogen provide the bonds that keep the two strands of DNA's double helix together. Under certain conditions, hydrogen can behave like a wave, existing in multiple locations at once, a state of superposition. As a result of proton tunneling, these atoms occasionally appear on the wrong strand of DNA, and this leads to mutations. And this isn't just an interesting curiosity. If quantum tunneling really is responsible for some genetic mutations, it could change how we understand diseases that begin with a single, tiny error in our DNA, including some cancers. Scientists studying this mechanism hope that it could eventually lead to new ways of predicting which mutations are likely to occur or even new drugs designed to stabilize these hydrogen bonds and prevent certain mutations before they happen. The same quantum tunneling behavior seen in enzymes is already inspiring researchers to design more efficient industrial catalysts and enzymes, modeled directly on nature's own quantum tricks. Perhaps the most exciting discovery of all involves one of science's oldest mysteries. How do birds find their way home? Every year, birds fly back from winter climates to the exact same breeding grounds in spring. Some species land back in the same spot down to a few centimeters, and many of them do this completely alone, at night with no parents, no flock, and no daylight to guide them. So how do they know exactly where to go? Well, for a long time, nobody had a good answer. But quantum biology may have finally found one. Birds might be sensing Earth's magnetic field using quantum physics. So here's how it works. Migrating birds have a special protein called cryptochrome 4. Inside this protein, electrons sometimes jump from one molecule to another, leaving behind unpaired electrons. When two of these unpaired electrons form together, they become sensitive to magnetic fields. This pairing is what may let these birds sense which direction is north, all happening naturally inside of their own cells. This same protein also helps run the bird's internal body clock, which fits since it's already wired to track subtle natural signals. There is still a lot we don't understand about bird migration, but quantum biology has brought us closer to an answer than ever before. And maybe the most exciting part is this. Nature may have already built its own quantum compass, millions of years before we even knew quantum physics existed. Surely, this can't be the only example of quantum states explaining a biological phenomenon. In the years to come, we are bound to discover other quantum behavior among life on Earth. Perhaps quantum physics can even explain one of the most baffling features of the human condition: consciousness. How is it that something like consciousness exists in a world that is governed by classical physics? Scientists and philosophers have tried to reduce it to the physical states we can observe using technology, but the deterministic nature of this reduction seems incredibly unsatisfying. The answer to this concern may lie in quantum. Currently, quantum consciousness is entirely theoretical, and it's met with considerable skepticism. Most scientists suggest that the brain is too wet and too warm to host conscious states. However, we have likely found quantum behavior in bird proteins, so it's not impossible that it could explain our conscious experience. The Nobel Prize-winning cosmologist Roger Penrose suggests that quantum superposition may create a moment of proto-consciousness. Small structures in our neurons and other cells called microtubules might then weave these moments together into a tapestry of full conscious experience. Other theories suggest that conscious experience may come when quantum superpositions form. Ultimately, though, quantum consciousness is still largely theoretical. However, a 2018 study from China may offer some indication that consciousness may indeed be quantum. The researchers in this study explored how 4 forms of noble gas, xenon, affected the consciousness of lab mice. Xenon possesses anesthetic properties which would have an obvious impact on these rodents. Each of the 4 isotopes in the experiment were chemically identical, but each one had a different spin, which is a quantum property that is connected to particle momentum. The result of the experiment raised some eyebrows. Each form of xenon had different anesthetic effects in the mice. The findings suggested a possible link between quantum properties such as spin and changes in consciousness. The faster spin might be creating a larger superposition, resulting in more complex conscious experiences for the mice. This would suggest that consciousness could indeed be quantum-based. Scientists are currently trying to replicate the experiment on lab-grown brain cells for more answers. So, as you can see, there is some potential evidence of consciousness being quantum. If true, it would completely change the science and philosophy of the mind. And if consciousness is indeed quantum, then it's possible there are entanglements that could be operating below the surface. I'm sure many of you have had that experience where you think about someone and moments later they call you or they send you a text. Now it's all still fairly speculative at this point, but at the very least, in our exploration of quantum mechanics, we have strong evidence that reality is highly relational and intertwined in very interesting ways. We shouldn't just think of ourselves as divided, self-reliant individuals. For all the good and bad things in our lives, there is a connected web of reality underneath the surface. We don't need to give ourselves all the credit, but neither do we need to take all the blame. Everything we've talked about in this video exists only in theories and labs. But if you want to see how quantum mechanics actually affects you in your daily life, watch the video on screen right now.